Hey everybody, Doug here, still on summer break. Hope you are enjoying your summer as much as I am. And I hope you enjoyed our replay episode last time of our interview with Pete Ruggieri. This episode I chose from our 2022 season because this, out of all of the interviews that I did last year, made me think the most. And I really liked that. Hiram Smith, the episode that I'm going to replay today, originally aired on the 15th of June. So exactly a little more than 1 year ago from today, being the 15th of July. Now, Hiram is a professor of Spanish and Linguistics at Bucknell University, and he is also African American. And he brought a perspective to the front porch that often is underrepresented. And he really challenged me, and hopefully you guys as well, to think about a lot of different things. And if you missed this interview, here's your chance to hear it, and I'm sure that it will make you think as well. So sit back and enjoy this rebroadcast of my interview with Hiram Smith, and we'll be back with brand new content here in the very near future. But until then, dear friends, take care and keep enjoying the summer. Singing Dutchman Productions. Hello and welcome to Doug's Front Porch, a podcast where I get to sit down with friends old and new and have honest conversations. Today I welcome Hiram Smith to the front porch, a friend that I've gotten to recently know, but we've never actually physically met each other, and it's such a joy to be able to actually talk with you other than typing back and forth on Facebook. Hiram, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'll tell the audience, or we can tell the audience, how we got to know each other a little bit later, but I always like to start all my episodes off with kind of introducing you to the audience. So could you tell us, and from what I gather from interacting with you on Facebook, you've been a lot of places in your life, but let's talk about growing up. Where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? Did you have brothers and sisters? That kind of stuff.
Well, I was born in Stuttgart, Germany at the Bad Cannstatt Army Hospital, and I was raised in a place called Lawton, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and which is a military town. I do have siblings. I have a younger brother. I've got two younger sisters, my mom and dad, and that's where we were raised. So I grew up with a bunch of military brats and a bunch of local brats, and I was one of them.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I did not grow up a military brat, and I know that that term gets thrown around a lot. But to you, what does that mean? What is a military brat to you, and how would you describe what that is?
Well, I think it just means a kid whose parents are in the military. They travel around a lot. They don't have any roots in a sense, because our friends. I stayed in Lawton. My parents got out of the military, and so we stayed. But a lot of my friends, they would cycle through, so they'd be in Germany for 4 years, and sometimes you'd see them in middle school, and then you'd see them again later in high school, or you never saw them again. So it was kind of that type of deal.
What do you think that teaches you as a person in regards to? I would imagine it would create somebody that is easily flexible, able to interact with anybody. Is that the case? Do you think?
I think that's a good assessment because we grew up. You had a black soldier and with a German wife. I went to school with their kids. A white soldier with a Korean wife, their kids. Samoan, Tongan, Puerto Rican. I mean, and then you have lots of African Americans there. The canonical cowboys and Indians. I mean, this is Oklahoma, and so we mixed with a lot of different folks, and then of course when you grow up in a place like Oklahoma, you have a very rich storytelling tradition and a tradition of joke telling, and that's just kind of who we are as a people. So you get a lot of that, and of course in a town that's very transient. um I guess that's just another layer that you put in that big old black pot and you stir it all together and you get a strange dude like me. You know?
Well, you talk about a strange dude like you. So you grew up in Oklahoma, as you've told us. Where were your parents originally from?
Well, my mom is from she was born in Far Rockaway Beach, New York. My grandmama's from Sparta, Georgia. My granddaddy was from North Carolina. My stepdad was from Connorsville, Indiana. And my biological father died in a car accident tragically when I was a baby. So I never knew him, but he was from Oklahoma.
So you have all of these pins on a map of America, and do you have a connection to any of them when we talk about like place and where someone comes from? So your family tree is all over geographically in the United States. Do you connect to any of those localities?
Yeah, very much so. Probably not Far Rockaway. At least I don't feel the connection. But the South, I mean, Oklahoma is a place kind of like Texas. It's not considered the South, but it is very Southern. The food is Southern, you know, grits and collard greens and chicken fried steak and biscuits and gravy. And then, of course, the language that you speak and that you hear growing up is also, it's Southern in a way, but it's also the plains. My We lived in Indiana for a year when I was in the fifth grade. And so, I got to meet a lot of my stepdad's relatives and so forth. And so there's a type of connection there. But I think that me as a person, I'm very Oklahoma. I'm countryer than a turnip green, but I'm also very Southern in a lot of ways.
What do you mean by that? Give me an example.
Well, I mean, just the language that you speak. I mean, what I'll give you an example. So, for example, my grandmama would say something like, "Bite up that sandwich Twix, y'all." And
Could you translate that for us, please?
can you translate it?
Eat your sandwich, something
Yeah,
along those lines.
you're close. Divide up that sandwich between you two.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Bite up that sandwich Twix, y'all. And you get stuff like that. But then you grow up just hearing all kinds of Southern phrases and expressions and African American English expressions. I'm sure we'll talk about this in more depth.
I want to come back to that, but real quick, let's fast forward a little bit.
Sure.
So you eventually go to school and you get advanced degrees, and you are now a professor of Spanish, correct, at Bucknell University
And linguistics.
and linguistics. So
Yes.
what took you down the road of advanced study of Spanish in particular and linguistics?
Wow, Doug, you just did a lot of fast forwarding because there's a lot of water under that bridge. I didn't go to school. I didn't pursue higher education until I was 31. And although I was a straight A student all through school, including elementary and high school, I didn't go to college. And there are a lot of reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is because we grew up in poverty. And sometimes let me just say kudos to my parents. My parents would read to us, even when we were little. They would, my dad would get out the Globe and we'd play these games, name the capital, or he'd get out dictionaries and we'd have to guess definitions and so forth. And they would read us stories. And I was able to read since I was 3. So my parents always valued learning, but I don't know if they ever saw the possibility of going to college, to a university. So I think that, your parents say, stay in school. Well, my stepdad, he was an old school working class guy. So for him, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if I'm going to interpret this retroactively, I think that for him, stay in school was like, stay in high school. Don't drop out of high school. When you're 16 or so, you're a man, get you a factory job. So I didn't really see that. So when I left school, despite the fact that I was a good student, I did a lot of zigzagging in my life. more zagging than zigging. Um, there was a time, Doug, believe it or not, that I found myself homeless on the streets. I hitchhiked all over the country, um, the whole 9 yards. But when I was in those situations, there were certain things that I always reached back and I was able to find myself grounded somehow. One was my parents, and what I just told you. My mom lived in Italy and Germany as a little girl because her dad was in the military. And so she spoke German and some Italian, and she would teach me some words. I could count to 100, you know. So those are things that I kind of reach back in, but I want to just point to a very special person. He was my high school Spanish teacher. His name was Scotty Simpson. Now, Scotty, I call him Scotty now, he's Mr. Simpson, but Scotty, he befriended me. He took a personal interest in me as a young person. And I don't know if it was because I was a poor kid or because I was a good student or some combination of both, but he mentored me. And so later in life, when I found myself wondering, what am I going to do with myself? I reached back to that. And at some point, I'll probably circle back to Scotty Simpson because he was a very significant figure in my emotional and intellectual development. And so when I said to myself, what am I going to do? I said, well, maybe I'll study Spanish. It's my favorite class. And it started right there. So at 31 years old, I was living in Albuquerque. I was a single dad. I had 3 kids. I started going to school. I discovered Spanish. Then I discovered linguistics, and the rest is kind of history. That's a long-winded way to answer a simple question.
But sometimes, you go back to saying about how Oklahoma, you're a storyteller, and you can hear you can hear the passion in when you tell that story, because it is, all too often, I think we do gloss over things when we talk to people. They're like, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, I teach German. And sometimes people be like, oh, why did you choose that? And that allows a door to be open to tell a story. But all too often, I think we just gloss over these things. And when we think about how important individuals can be in somebody's life journey, or just one little thing, like the butterfly effect, one little thing can change a complete direction of somebody's life. And you shared your story there. I was smiling the whole time just listening to you tell that story, because I could, even though I can't personally relate with some of the things that happened to you, I can definitely relate to the aspect of seeing you having, pulling back to those past experiences and saying, well, this is something that is foundational in me that I can take and build upon. So that was just great. All right. So let's quickly talk about, you are now in central Pennsylvania. So we talked about how, your family's from all over the United States, and you have this background in Oklahoma and that part of the country. But now you are in the hills and valleys of central Pennsylvania teaching at Bucknell. What was your initial reaction to coming to this part of Pennsylvania?
Well, my wife and I and my kids, because I remarried, and we moved to State College from Albuquerque. I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 10 years, which is a fascinating place, culturally and linguistically. So we get to Pennsylvania. Believe it or not, I wasn't a big football fan. So I wasn't even familiar with the Nittany Lions, I'm embarrassed to say now. But I got my PhD from Penn State and in linguistics, Spanish and linguistics. And then that was in 2014. And then I got a JOB at Bucknell University. And so we've been living here in Lewisburg since 2014.
And how do you find the people of central Pennsylvania compared to, we always get the north-south divide and we say, oh, well, Southerners are this type of people and Northerners are this type of people. But from your own perspective, having lived in a couple different places, what's your take as an outsider to Pennsylvania and Pennsylvanians?
I love Pennsylvania. I mean, I think a lot of us can do without the 6 months of winter. But I tell you what, when you're talking about relative paradigms, it's better than living in tornado season too in Oklahoma. But I find that the people are very friendly, very open. Now, some people will say that when you go out west, attitudes are more relaxed, and in some ways, that's kind of true. But I think when you get to talk to people and get to talking to people here, you find that people are very willing to share stuff with you, open up their lives. And I've met so many friends, old people, young people, people who speak Pennsylvania German, just across the board. I've eaten at so many dinner tables here in Central PA, and I just love it. And it's funny because in some strange way, I've gained access as a Black guy from Oklahoma who is not from this area than people who have been here in their whole lives. I've heard people discuss, for example, how Pennsylvania Dutch are kind of standoffish or this, and that's not been my general experience. I've had some of the best experiences in people's homes that I can compare across my entire life. So I love PA. I like Central PA. I do wish there was more stuff to do here. That we're 3 hours from any kind of a zoo. But that aside, it's a nice place to live.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I'm glad that your experience has been positive, of course, or at least the majority of it. I want to circle back now to something that we talked about earlier, and you are a linguist, and what I'm a language nerd, as everybody listening to the podcast knows, but you have done research, and I've seen you post stuff on social media about African American English. Yes. Now, as a white farm boy, Pennsylvania Dutch boy growing up in southeastern Pennsylvania, and having only really ever met, all of the African Americans that I know that I've met, I didn't meet until I went to college. And at the college that I went to, there weren't a lot of African Americans there either. So it was limited access. And I got to know most of them through the choir because they sang with us. But anyway, looking at it now from the language perspective, and I've often wondered about this, and you're the guy, I'm putting you on the spot. Can you explain to the audience what African American English is? Is it more than just an accent? Is it a language? What is it?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Of course, we all in this in every country, but in this country, we all have some sort of an accent. We speak a regional variety, but there are also what we call ethnic varieties. I mean, for example, you can live in Philadelphia, but you have Italian Philly, Irish Philly, right? African American Philly, Asian American. And so Black English is a language variety that developed because the African slaves who were brought here and some born here were isolated from other varieties of English. This language variety also has Creole language contributions. It has been found to have words and phrases and grammar from old colonial Irish and Scots-Irish varieties. And obviously there are some African contributions. And of course, many of those African words like banana and banjo and so forth and jazz are now mainstreamed. But you can say that Black English is a variety. You find certain things in African American English that you do not find in other varieties of mainstream English. Or they're way more frequent in Black English than they are in other varieties. Let me give you an example. So in Black English, for example, you can say, yeah, Doug Mayford, yeah, he cool. Or Hiram crazy. Now you can take that copula verb to be in African American English, and you don't need it. Now, this is the most frequent verb, or at least one of the most frequent verbs in English. And there are some theories as to why you can do this in African American English, but you can do this in many other languages. So some of those theories have to do with that. Central West African languages do this. If I can just give you one more example, speaking of the verb to be, you can use it in an unconjugated way. So you could say, yeah, Doug be hosting that podcast every week. Okay. Now, this is for some people was what we call a camouflaged form, because it sounds like other varieties of English. It just kind of seems like the verb is not conjugated. But really what Black people are doing is when you have the invariant be, it serves a habitual function. So if I say Doug be hosting the podcast every week, it means he does this habitually. Or sometimes my ears be itching. Now, people who imitate Black speech, sometimes you'll see comedians do this. They'll say, yeah, I'd be a doctor and I'd be a lawyer. Well, you can't do that in Black English. That verb to be only means a habitual action. It can't be used as a copula verb. So studies in African American English over the last several decades have pointed out some of these things. And one of the major findings is that there are rules. It's not just a collection of errors. You can't just say anything you want to. There's a grammatical system that's rule governed. And so this is part of my research. I'm sure we'll talk about this, but it's also a new part of a new initiative that's been carried out by the Oxford English Dictionary.
Well, go ahead and tell us about that real quick.
Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of research by language scholars on this variety, especially since about 1968, when William LaBeouf, a white linguist, incidentally from Philadelphia, began doing some studies on African American English. Most recently, you have the Oxford English Dictionary. Oxford has been undertaking its first major revision of the dictionary. Its only revision in 150 years. And so what they decided to do is review all of the lexical entries, all 600,000 of them, because there's new technology, there's digitized collections, there's new scholarship, there's all these things, and they want to revisit the dictionary. Well, one of the things that come out of this project is that all of the entries labeled African American English, they wanted to revisit as well. Because for decades, people have written into the dictionary and said, hey, this isn't quite right. This is not how we say it. This is totally wrong. The pronunciation is off and so forth. What came out of those conversations is they said, hey, there is so much material here that I think we can create a new dictionary. And so what's come out of that is now there's a project to produce the Oxford Dictionary of African American English. And so I'm one of the lexicographers on the project. And so we are very soon going to start looking at words that are presently in the dictionary, words that are not, but probably should be. And so that promises to be a really exciting project.
That sure is. And it gives a lot more, validation to the language too. I mean, when this isn't just, Joe Schmo putting out a book, this is, the Oxford. I have a quick question in regards to all of this. So, coming from someone that is also has a background in a minority language, we'll take Pennsylvania Dutch as an example. How is African American English viewed among African Americans? Is it a sign, so the background, of course, with Pennsylvania Dutch is within, once we got into the 20th century, it was seen as this language that only the farmers spoke, and if you spoke it, then you weren't educated, and it was a sign of you're not with the times. Why are you speaking this old, archaic language? But African American English is spoken in America today by Black Americans. Does it have that kind of weight on it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It may be the most stigmatized speech variety in the country. It's often labeled slang. ghetto, uneducated. You know what I mean? And what's interesting about that is Black people are educated in the general American school system too. So we're taught to not strand our prepositions. We're also taught to right to pronounce your R's and pronounce your INGs. And so what that does is, and of course we're corrected and chastised in class, just like other students are, if not more so. But what that does, I think, when you don't validate, or, and I'm speaking from a teacher's perspective, or at least understand the language varieties that are spoken in the classroom, it can produce a sort of linguistic inferiority complex in children, you know. And a bigger problem is then you come home and you think that your mom and your grandma are wrong in some ways, and that they don't have the wisdom that they have. But an even more serious problem is that we know, especially in inner city schools, that African American children, and boys in particular, are disproportionately corrected. They're taken and put in speech pathology courses and special education programs simply because they speak African American English. There's been a long-standing assumption that there's a linguistic or cognitive deficiency. What's the matter? You can't see that R? I mean, is there something wrong with you? So there's an R right there. Pronounce it. So the child says, close the door and mop the floor. That could fast track him or her out of the mainstream classroom. And we know that some of the effects that can have in the long run on kids. And so when Black people get into society, of course, I think everybody has this running joke: I can speak Black English, but I can also speak job interview, right? And we all kind of know generally what that means. But I think that by speaking job interview, sometimes we can internalize perceptions, societal perceptions about ourselves, and we can believe that about ourselves, that our language is inferior, that the way we talk is, or my grandmama talked was wrong. And I think there are a lot of not just individual problems that are associated with that, but certainly in society at large. If I can give you just one example, a couple of years ago, we have the George Floyd case. Now there was a an audio tape that had, well, that came into evidence, and it was debated whether or not he said, "I ate too many drugs." So I think the one side was saying that that's what the tape said. But when you listen to the tape, if you knew African American English 101, you realize that he said, "I ain't ate any drugs," which is the exact opposite. Now, it turned out that everything turned out fine. But, you know, there have been studies that have shown that court transcriptions and so forth that got African American English wrong had serious consequences for the plaintiff or the defendant. If you take the Trayvon Martin, the George Zimmerman murder case, his Trayvon's best friend, a young girl named Rachel Jantel, she was Black. She was the prosecution's star witness. She testified for 6 hours. She was on the phone with Trayvon when he got into the altercation. She heard the scream, she heard the shot. But she spoke African American English. She was not literate. When the jury acquitted George Zimmerman, they were asked by Piers Morgan on CNN about various aspects of their decision making. And they asked her, juror B37, what do you think about Rachel Jantel's testimony? And the juror said, "We couldn't understand a word she said. We didn't find her credible." So what is that, right? These have serious implications. There's this research that was done in Philadelphia. We keep circling back to Philly somehow, but by a colleague of mine named Taylor Jones in his co-authors, they did this study of Philadelphia court reporters. Now, a court reporter is supposed to be accurate. They're certified 97% accuracy. You've got to be good, and you've got to be lightning fast. When it came to African American English, a study found their accuracy levels went down to 40 and 60%. These are people who are from Philadelphia, who've been around Black people their entire lives, and they're trained professionals and can't understand African American English. So there are so many implications behind this research and the project. And of course, as you mentioned in your question, and what it does to people as individuals.
That what you just talked about absolutely blows me away. I had no idea. I honestly had no idea. And if I didn't, someone that's into languages, you imagine that the average American has no idea that this is.
Yeah.
Well, I bet there's a lot of African Americans that don't know that, when it gets to the, thinking like court trials and so forth, that they're not being understood or they're being misinterpreted when they're on the stand or in a jury box. That absolutely blows my mind.
Yeah, it raises these really interesting and in some ways strange questions, because it's like, should we have interpreters in the courtroom for dialects of the same language?
I was thinking that when you were telling that story, and then I was thinking, well, let's go back 130 years or so when there were other immigrants that were on trial, whether they were Polish Americans or Slavs of some kind, and how often were they probably also misunderstood for whatever reason in court that could have led to a guilty verdict when it should have been innocent, or or vice versa. It's crazy to think of. I've never thought about that. Never.
Well, and some of these misunderstandings are totally legitimate. I do this experiment. So a minute ago we talked about habitual be. Sometimes my ears be itching. Well, I do this experiment with my students because I teach a course on African American English sometimes. And so I showed them a picture of Cookie Monster, okay, from Sesame Street, right? And in the picture, Cookie Monster doesn't have any cookies. And then I show them a picture of Elmo. And in this picture, Elmo is eating cookies. And so I asked the students, I say, okay, who be eating cookies? Cookie Monster or Elmo? Now, all of my students who speak Black English will say, Cookie Monster be eating cookies, because they know that he's the one who does it habitually. He doesn't have to have cookies in his mouth presently. All of the other students, though, will say, Elmo be eating cookies, because they interpret be eating as an action that's happening right now, present progressive. Now, you take that to a courtroom. When did the defendant do this? Was it something habitual? Was it a one-time action when you're in the sentencing phase? These are legitimate misunderstandings. But then, of course, when you talk about misunderstandings, there is research that has shown that they've done these studies where you have a voice, an audio recorded voice, and if you tell the person who's listening to the voice that the speaker is Asian American, they more often than not claim not to understand the speaker. Same voice, and stuff like that. So even when we make claims of not being able to understand someone, some of those are suspect too. It's just a really complicated scenario.
So where do you see African American English moving forward? Is it a language that is going to persist? Is it, or do you think eventually in, 2 generations, 3 generations, it's going to slowly die out as America becomes more amalgamated, or whatever you want to call it? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I think generally people ask this question because they say, hey, we've got the internet, we've got TV, we've got radio. Are we becoming more similar linguistically than apart? Well, studies have shown that the counter to our expectations and our intuitions, the opposite is actually true. Even in mainstream or other varieties of English, for example, we're seeing this northern cities vowel shift, where the vowels are shifting in places like Rochester and Buffalo and Philadelphia and so forth. So catch a cab is now catch a cab. The vowels are moving kind of up in front in the mouth. African American English, while it is true that let me just use one qualifier. Not all African Americans speak African American English, and there's not just one African American English variety. There are regional varieties. I mean, this just makes intuitive sense, just like other varieties. But there's something that linguists call covert prestige. So even though this speech variety it does not have prestige in our general American society, it's actually looked down upon. But within the speech community, it has a covert prestige. Maybe something similar can be said about Pennsylvania Dutch, right? Some speakers value it. They teach it to their kids. They don't want to lose it. It's a way of its identity. It's a way of connecting to oneself and to one's history, to your people, and so forth. And so, if for no other reason than covert prestige, African American English is here to stay. And so, we've seen this over time. And despite educational systems' best efforts to educate it out of you, to punish it out of you, sometimes to beat it out of kids. We've seen that. It's still a very robust variety.
All right, I want to ask a tough question, and I know this could be a whole episode all in of its own, and maybe I'll have you back for this, but I want a short discussion on the N-word.
Okay.
And there's, from my perspective, of course, that it's this word that even just saying the N-word, when I was thinking about, do I want to ask this question? I felt all this like weird pressure, like, oh,
should you?
Yeah, right. But then I was thinking, if I don't ask it, I'm going to regret not asking it. And I know that there are a lot of people out there, particularly white people like me, that, especially in this day and age, are grappling with, what does that word even mean? I think it's pretty common that now most people realize that, this is a word that is off limits, et cetera, et cetera. But can you unpack, and I know this is a huge question and it's a whole PhD thesis, but can you unpackage that a little bit and make it friendly for our audience so they can kind of get their heads kind of wrapped around about it, or at least open their minds a little bit as to what that word is?
Well, I know you're asking me this because I've done research on the N-word, and I'm currently writing a book about it, about its history and about its usage. When I first started doing this research, you see television programs where people are getting chastised or losing their jobs, or they're just having discussions about its meaning and whether or not it should be used. And frequently what you do hear by individuals is that, well, for African Americans, it's what they've done is they've taken what was a racial slur at one time, and they've changed it, they've flipped it, they've repackaged it, they've reappropriated it and turned it into a sort of term of endearment to be used amongst themselves. And of course, that would imply that people who are outside of the community, it's still taboo. When I first started hearing those types of arguments, the first thing that I thought to myself was, yeah, you can use it in a term of endearment sort of way. I've heard that and I've used it before. But how do you know that it's changed meanings? You can't know that unless you have a historical component. You have to know how the word was used in the past. Did Black people use it going back to slavery times? If so, how did they use it? When did they begin using it? These were all questions that I had. And so I started doing this research, and what I found is there was no research, or there was very, very little research on this phenomenon. So what I found is that in my own research is that African Americans have been using the N-word amongst themselves going all the way back to slavery times. And in fact, it's attested as far back as 1825. The first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, had an article in there debating whether or not Black people should use the N-word amongst themselves. The debate's not even new. I mean, this is really interesting stuff. But But what I also found is that the ways in which African Americans have used the word towards themselves, to each other, in friendly ways, if you will, but also in other ways, because it's not always used in friendly ways, even among African Americans. You can use them in very negative, the word in very negative ways. But that usage goes all the way back, and we've actually seen very little change over time. What is new is that when stand-up comedians like Red Fox and Richard Pryor entered the scene with their blue comedy, and by blue, I mean they use lots of profanity, and they even used the N-word, and their subject matter was taboo. Those records were very popular, and they were very popular among white audiences around the middle of the last century. That was the first time that many white people heard Black people use the N-word. But the reason Richard Pryor and those guys used it is because there was a long unbroken chain going all the way back to slavery times of Black people using this word. So when whites began to hear Black people use the N-word, they said, whoa, this is weird. Why would a Black person use the N-word? This is only a racial slur. Fast forward to hip hop music, the 1980s and 90s. Now you're having music that features the N-word blaring out of people's car windows, right? In middle-class neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods. And we know that the major consumer of hip hop music today are white kids, white youth from 16 to 30 years of age. So now you have this new group of people hearing this language that up to this point had really only been spoken within Black communities. And so to many white people's dismay, it's like, why would you ever use such a word with such a terrible history toward yourself, to each other? What's not understood is why African slaves began calling themselves this word to begin with, and also how the word has been used historically within African American communities. And the reason why Black people began calling themselves and referring to themselves with this term initially is because that's what we were called from the moment we stepped on the shores or from birth. They didn't know any better. This is how you referred to Black people in the 1800s. There were no social movements. There was no political correctness. There was no counterculture. There was no scholarship to fight against or push back or any of this. And so we internalized the word from the get-go. And then there's just been an unbroken chain of use. It's only very new and it's very recent that anybody has really seriously challenged, critiqued, questioned, pushed back against the use of anybody using the word, including Black people. And just to, not to put too fine a point on it, but one of the things that we see now, of course, is I think one of the biggest issues is that can white kids use it? Hey, they listen to the music, they have Black friends, is it taboo? Is it wrong? Are they appropriating the culture? Like you said, that's a dissertation. But the fact is when you do the historical research, you find that, of course, white people originated the term in the sense of the racial slur. But we also find evidence of whites using the term in very affiliative ways. Going back to the middle of the last century, let me just give you one example. In the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, Malcolm X tells his life story. Before he was joined the Nation of Islam, he was a drug dealer, he was a pimp. Everybody knows his story. He went to prison, the whole story. Well, one of those stories, he was in Harlem. He knew this guy. There's a chapter in this book called Sammy the Pimp. And Sammy the Pimp had a woman who was a prostitute who worked for him, a white woman. Her name was Alabama Peach. This is what her nickname was. Well, in this book, Malcolm recalls, he said, what used to make the Negroes around the bar laugh the hardest is the way she would take 3 syllables to say the N-word because she was Southern. And she would say, he said she used to say, I just love niggas. Now, when you analyze this, you have a white woman using the N-word in Harlem in 1942 in an all-Black context and facing no reprisal. Malcolm recalls that he said the Negroes used to laugh the hardest, and he spoke of her with fondness. And so examples like Alabama Peach turn on its head the fact that white people have only recently begun appropriating Black speech, and in particular the N-word. It turns on its head that white people cannot use it among Blacks and with Blacks in quote unquote friendly ways. We see evidence of this going back at least to the middle of the last century. And what's interesting about that is it's suggestive of other people, just like Alabama Peach, who were around Black people, who hung around Black people, who were in the African-American speech community and picked up their speech, or perhaps have been speaking like African-Americans since childhood. These are complicated questions because it's about who your caregivers are, where you were raised, how you were raised, at what time period you were raised. And for me as a linguist and as an African-American man, it's not just about who can say it and who can't. I know that's a lot. Again, this is kind of long-winded, but that's just kind of how I see. So I think that these conversations really need to be dimensionalized. It's not just about finger wagging and assigning blame, because whether we like it or not, all words have social histories. This word is not any different in that respect. It's a noun, and it's used the way nouns are used. We can use nouns in positive, neutral, or negative ways. So in that way, it's no different. But I think what makes this unusually charged is that when it is wielded as a racial slur, it can be very, and it has been very devastating to Black people. But that's not its only use.
Where do you, I'm going to ask you to look in your crystal ball, but do you see that word changing in the future?
You mean changing meanings or changing?
Well, yeah, in any change in usage. Do you think? Do you imagine that the usage of the word might start to decrease, or the meaning might start to change? Or look, I teach high school, and you struck it. I teach kids that are predominantly white, rural kids that hunt and fish, that listen to only hip hop and rap music. Yeah. And they come in and they know every lyric to these songs. They can get up in front of this class. And I often think to myself, how many of you actually know what you're rapping about, or what, and is it just that you love the beat? And I've talked to them a lot about this because it truly fascinates me. So, I would think if you have a generation, or you have 2 generations now that are really being influenced by that style of music and that language, will the word in its usage and its amount of usage change in the future? I know this is totally speculation, but what do you think?
It's a great question. And I think that the field of linguistics has already kind of answered it in a way, in the sense that, first of all, we know that language changes. If there's anything that you can say about language, is that it will change. Now, from a linguistic point of view, language change is neither good nor bad, it's just inevitable. When you have communities, though, that do appropriate language that is not theirs, it's, first of all, in the case of the N-word, it's already changed in white communities. I did a study in 2019 for a special issue of American Speech Journal. The whole issue is about the N-word. And there are a couple of other really good articles as well. But the research that I found is that when it comes to the use of the term my nigga, for example, it's not Black people who use it as a term of endearment, it's white males. This is what the data showed, that white males, way more than any other group, will use the term with so-called positive or endearment meanings compared to other groups. And the other groups were white females, and black males. There's some other research, just not about the N-word, but about African-American English more generally. I'll give you an example. Greg Guy and Cecilia Cutler did some research on white hip hoppers. So you've got white kids, the demographic that you described. And what they did, they looked at their language and compared it to like their parents and their black friends. And what they found is that these white hip hoppers didn't pattern like their parents or their black friends. The data was chaotic. And so, and it makes sense from a linguistic point of view that the data would be chaotic because this is not their vernacular. And what studies have shown for decades is that a person's vernacular, which is your most unmonitored, unself-reflecting speech register, this is what, when you're not putting on any airs, you're at home drinking a beer, talking to your kids, that even though that is probably the most non-standard variety that a person may speak, it's the most systematic and the most regular, because that's who we are at our core. And so when you're speaking something that isn't yours to your core, obviously you're going to show distortion, and that's what the studies show.
It is absolutely fascinating. Oh my gosh, I'm blown away. I try to keep the episodes all within an hour, so we're gonna have to cut this off. But I'm gonna have you back on, Hiram, because there's some things I didn't get a chance to talk to you about.
Okay, sure.
But I close every episode out with 10 quick questions, and this has nothing to do with anything we've talked about. This is just to kind of get a better snapshot of who you are as a person. So,
will these be timed?
No, they're not timed, but usually the responses are really quick. That's just the way it works out. So, all right, here we go. Number 1, what is your morning drink of choice?
Water.
Are you a coffee guy at all?
No, I love the taste and the aroma, but it makes me a mite nervous.
Oh, okay, that's all right. Okay, question number 2. Who is a go-to musical artist or group for you?
Oh, gosh, that's not even fair.
I know, it's a tough question.
I love it all, but I'll say Duke Ellington.
Oh,
I love all kinds of music.
It's the same for me. When I always think about when I ask this question to people, if I was ever to answer this, I'm the same way with you. Like, I can go from jazz to classical to old school country to it's crazy.
I love it.
Sounds good. But Duke Ellington's a great answer. All right, number 3. What movie can you watch over and over again and it doesn't get old?
Oh gosh. Also not fair. I love old black and white movies, but my granddaughter and I just watched James Cagney last night, The Roaring Twenties. But anything black and white.
I hear you. All right, I wasn't going to ask this, but I just thought of it. Out of all of the black historical movies that try to tell the black story in America, which one do you think does it really well from your perspective?
Man, we saw a recent the new version of Roots that came out in 2016, the remake. That was pretty interesting when you compare it to the original miniseries from the 70s. They did a lot of things right.
Okay, I have to ask this question, and this is just me being curious.
Yeah.
You're an African American, and you're watching Roots, whether it's the 1970s version or this newer version, which I didn't get a chance to see yet. It's on my list, but from what I heard, it's pretty graphic in its portrayal of what slavery was like. What is that like for you to watch that and see that? Like, do you get angry? Or do you get, is it a combination? I'm sure it's a combination of emotions, but there's no movie out there that tells a story like that for me as a white Pennsylvania Dutch person that shows such a I don't even know how to articulate what I'm saying. I'm going to stop speaking. When you see something like that, a movie that deals with slavery, or if you watch Glory that tells the story of the 54th Massachusetts.
Another good movie.
Yeah, absolutely. From your perspective, what what do you feel when you watch stuff like that?
Well, if you're not angry, you're either, this is what Maya Angelou said when asked something similar, you're either a stone or you're too sick to be angry. Of course, as a human being, we should be outraged at this type of thing. But I think for me, I would rather that they get it right and get the history right, because it's been so sanitized and deodorized and sugar coated and stuff's been left out. For me, that's the most important thing. And to just tell me what happened, and I'll try to find out a way to be in good sound and psychological health once I know the truth about, because for Black people, this is not just about a story, but it's about our great grandmothers and grandfathers.
Do you ever watch the PBS series Finding Your Roots?
Yeah.
With Henry Louis Gates.
Yes.
So I'm addicted to that show,
Yeah.
as someone that's really into genealogy. And what has been so powerful for me has been any time that he has had African-American guests on, and it happens quite often, and somehow through the grace of God or through just luck, they have been able to find the the ancestral roots of these African Americans, and can often tie them back to the exact plantation that their great grandmother or their great grandfather was a slave on. And when these guests are confronted with that information, it's there, black and white on the page, and how they have to process that. For me, as somebody that has no buy-in, essentially, other than watching it, and it's the human aspect of it, that has been some of the most powerful TV for me, to see how these are, a lot of times it's Hollywood, actors and actresses that are the guests on these shows. So people that are coming from usually some point of privilege in the sense that they have money or success or fame, but they're faced with this reality that 3 generations removed or 4 generations removed, their great-grandfather or great-great-grandmother was owned by another human being. And seeing how they try to process that and just, put themselves then, of course, in that situation. And, how much stronger can that tie be if you knew, your grandmother talked about her grandmother, and she was a slave, and just trying to, I find it so, of course, so emotional, but also just, I've tried to, sympathize, empathize with these people, and it's so wild. It's just so wild.
Well, when you think about, I've seen your post too, and you said this is my 4th or 5th grade paternal grandfather. You know the names, you know their story, you know where they came from, you know things about them. Now, what's interesting is when you do ancestry work, being African American, you hit a roadblock at 1870. So if you want to look at census records, we disappear at 1870 because we were just property before the Civil War, and we weren't named on the census. But in 1870, you see this explosion of names, and you're like, where did these people come from? And so it's not so much the fact that because we already know that our great grandmothers and so forth, that they had to lie spoon fashion in their own and in each other's urine and feces and menstrual flow and the filthy hatches of slave ships, just so we could be here. We know these stories, but I think the interesting thing about when you can do your ancestry is that we all want to know where we came from. We know the general story, but to be able to piece anything together, what does it do to a people when you have to survive on obliterated history and ashes? Everybody wants to know where they came from, and we celebrate tradition, we celebrate history, which is why we have all of these holidays, right? And every major and minor culture will reach back into their file and bring their ancestors with them. And sadly, for Black people, we can't do that. And I don't mean just the names of people who lived in this country, but the entire erasure of African history in our historical narrative in our historical discourse. It's the great sin of omission. What were the contributions of non-white peoples to the history of the world and certainly to the country? So when you can get a piece of that and you can know something about that, speaking of old movies, remember the Grapes of Wrath? There was a guy that said, his name was Muley, and he says, "This is my dirt. It ain't worth much, but it's mine." And if you can hold on to that, I think that's something that's very valuable. It has a lot of worth, at least for me, it does.
Oh, we could keep talking about some of this stuff. My goodness. All right. Okay. This is a good question. Number 4. What is the last thing that you read?
Pennsylvania Dutch Bible.
That's a good answer.
And English.
Good answer. All right. Number 5. What's your favorite pizza topping?
Pepperoni.
Okay. All right. Number 6. Laying on the beach or going for a hike?
Beach.
Okay. Do you like hiking? Are you an outdoors guy?
No, I enjoy it.
But you got the beach over there.
I'd rather be prostrate on the beach because there's a lot to that.
Yeah, there is. Okay, I'm curious about this one. Number 7. You have invited me over for dinner. What are you making?
Well, I will either make you some Southern cooking, which I love to cook, or I'll fire up my barbecue smoker, or my wife, Lisa, will make some Northern New Mexican food for you. Your choice.
Can we have all 3?
Have all 3.
I'll tell you, everybody out there, my wife and I, when we went cross country on our honeymoon, we spent, I think it was 2 or 3 nights, 2 for sure, if not 3, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'd never been to New Mexico before.
Oh, man.
And I'll tell you, I fell in love with New Mexico. And we haven't been back yet, but that is a plan. But
it's the land of enchantment.
It absolutely is. I mean, the license plates say that, but it is unbelievably beautiful. The people were wonderful, and the food. Oh my gosh! I mean,
out of this world.
Honestly, everybody put New Mexico on your list of destinations for sure.
Indeed.
All right. Number 8. What is a dream vacation destination of yours?
Well, I'll go anywhere, to be honest with you. But my wife and I are going to Antigua next month. And we're going to, speaking of dream, I'm going to Germany in September for a linguistics conference, but I want to see the place of my birth and I want to see the hospital where I was born. So I guess that's going to be my dream vacation.
That'll be Stuttgart's a great city. I've been there many times, and that part of Germany is just absolutely gorgeous. So you're in for a really good time, really good time.
Oh.
All right. What is something you're afraid of?
Well, if you want to circle back to hiking, I don't know how about those woods. I don't know, but I think like a lot of people, sometimes the truth is always a scary thing. But I do like to say that I have an unflinching commitment to trying to find the truth out about stuff, as painful as it may be. Truth about me, the truth about Black people, the truth about my mama. This has been something that's been on my mind a lot lately. So sorry to take the question into a strange direction, but that's what I've been thinking about.
That's an organic answer, though. That's an organic answer. All right, last question, number 10. What job, other than one that you've had, would you love to have?
Food truck. Don't have to think about that one. I love cooking. I love feeding people. I love entertaining. And I almost had a food truck in State College. I went down to City Hall, had the meeting with the guy, and he says, "Man, you should have been here a couple months ago. We just passed a city ordinance severely limiting the movement of food trucks. So you can't be on campus. You can't have a work after 10 o'clock at night. You can't post up on a street corner. You can't be within 500 feet of a business, a restaurant." And I said, forget it. So my food truck dream was squashed. That's a painful.
Maybe that's once you hang up the professor's tie, maybe that could be part of your retirement.
Food truck.
Hiram, it has been beyond a joy. It has been enlightening. I've learned You stretched my mind a lot today, and you were able to answer some questions that I've often had and have never really had, in my opinion, the right person to ask. So I appreciate
Sure.
that, and I do want to have you back on at some point because I
Yeah,
think I have like 6 or 7 other questions I didn't even get
okay.
to. But I just want to thank you so much for allowing,
Thank
giving up
you.
the time
Indeed.
coming up on the front porch, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future really soon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.